All right, you guys, this video is for Huda fans. If you are a Huda fan and you have been collecting her palettes, you might be wondering, do you already have the Pretty Grunge palette? Yes, there are a lot of cool tones in the Pretty Grunge palette, but I have to say, Huda has had plenty of cool tones in her palette previously. Let's take a closer look at the palette. The first two shades are definitely a little bit warmer tone leaning, but I have to say the rest of the palette is pretty cool tone. Here I'm filming next to a window and a white ring light. Here's my collection starting off with the nude palette. I was not expecting too many shades to be similar from this palette with the Pretty Grunge palette. But I was pretty curious about the Empowered palette because at a quick glance, the Empowered palette looks very similar to the Pretty Grunge palette, with the exception of those very bright gold shades. Here is my Naughty Nudes palette. I was expecting a lot of similarities with the Rose Quartz palette because the Rose Quartz palette has a lot of cool tones and it is purple leaning, but later we'll find out that there's something different with regards to the purples. Here is Mercury Retrograde. All right, so let's get the swatch party started. We're starting off with a shade called Liberty. It feels warm tone at first, but it might be a little bit warm but neutral leaning. And one thing I've noticed about this palette is shades look lighter in the pan, but when you apply them, especially as a swatch, they come out looking darker, but I'm not sure how they're going to translate onto the eyes. This shade looks very similar to a shade called Teddy from the new Nude palette. Let's look at the swatches to see how similar they actually are. They are very similar, but the Teddy shade is just slightly cooler tone. It's slightly pink, but they do look quite similar to each other. Next shade is called Heroin. It is a super light peachy shade. And we're going to compare it to a shade in the Mercury Retrograde palette called Momentum. I don't think they're very similar. The Mercury Retrograde shade is a lot pinker than the Heroin shade from this palette. Next shade that we're going with is Avant Garde. This is a cool tone, brown, shimmery shade. And I'm going to be just straight up with you guys. There's nothing like it in any of the palettes that I have. Next shade is a black shade called Renegade, and I can assure you, in any of the palettes that I have, there is no black matte. In the Empowered palette, we had this very dark sort of jelly Vaseline type of shade that was black, but nothing with the matte formula. Ooh, next shade is called Brave, and it's a very interesting color. It is like a light plum, but not too purple. It almost has a neutral feel. It does look similar to the shade Aura from the Rose Quartz palette. Now let's see if the swatch is similar too. I would say it is very similar, but the Rose Quartz one is a bit darker, but they do look like they're in the same sort of family. Next shade is called Beauty Chaos, and it is a pretty purple shade that is pretty obvious. So let's see if any of the purple shades from the Retrograde palette match it. It's clearly not a match. We can try one from the Rose Quartz palette. It is similar, but it's brighter. I would say all the purples are much brighter than this shade from the Pretty Grunge palette. The Beauty Chaos shade from the Pretty Grunge has maybe like a gray in it. It's just a much duller, more neutral, toned down purple. Okay, for the first row, I think maybe we found about 2 shades that are similar. Okay, so then let's move on to the second row with a shade called Rise Up. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I cannot figure out what color this is. Is it a brown shade? Is it like a light brown? Or I don't think it's a taupe. It at one time looked a little mustardy. I just don't know how to explain this shade. We're going to see if it's similar to the shade from the Naughty Nude palette. It's called Rough. Oh no. Yeah, definitely not. Next, we're going to pick up the shades Stand Up and Strong AF. Stand Up is a little bit more warmer leaning, but Strong AF is pretty clearly cool tone. But let's do a quick comparison. I'm going to take this shade from the Naughty and Nude palette called Tantric. And from the Retrograde palette, I'm going to take Galaxy and Gold Glitch. The shade Galaxy, the center one from the bottom row, looks very similar to Stand Up, the shade that I thought was a little bit on the warmer side, but now that I'm looking at it, they look more cool tone and a little pinky. Next shade is called Nirvana, and I think this shade name was so interesting because this very sort of cool tone, kind of plumish purpley brown, looked very much like this shade from the Rose Quartz palette called Mantra. I just thought it was really funny that the names were similar, Nirvana and Mantra, and the shades were similar too. Next shade is called Haphazard. This is a shimmery sort of plum shade, and it is actually quite similar to this shade called Courageous from the Empowered palette. Next shade is called Fearless, and it's also a cool tone brown, but it has a little bit more warmth to it compared to the Nirvana cool tone brown. And it is very similar to the shade called Confident from the Empowered palette. To recap the first two rows, in the first row, we found two shades that were similar to each other. And then in the second row, I actually found four shades that were similar to shades from other palettes. So we already have a total of 6 similar shades. We are on a roll. Moving on to the last row, I'm going to grab these first 3 shades. So here we have the shades Hope, Love Anarchy, and Maverick. So let's find comparable shades with the shade Hope. I'm going to grab these 2 from the Empowered palette and 1 from Rose Quartz. Here's the one from Empowered, and here's the one from Rose, and I don't think any of these are a good match. The shade Hope from Pretty Grunge is your basic cool tone brown, but the other shades had a little bit more of the color plum in them. The next shade called Love Anarchy, couldn't really find anything to match that. I grabbed this one from Retrograde, which was not similar. Looking at these 3 palettes, I tried to find the shade Maverick, which was like a really light taupey shimmery shade, but I couldn't really find anything similar. Ooh, I do really love this next shade called Rebel, and it is just a really interesting formula. It feels really foily. I'm so afraid that it's gonna make a mess and get all over, but it's such a beautiful shade. It is this sort of like very light golden, but has a bit of a purpley shifty effect in it. The next shade is a little bit of like a purpley matte shade called Freedom, and I couldn't find anything similar to this shade either. Okay, so the last shade in this palette is called Grunge, and it's this sort of slippery gel-like Vaseline shade, but the Empowered palette also had a black sort of jelly shade. So let's compare these 2 black shades. On top is the shade Grunge, and at the bottom is the shade called Purpose from the Empowered palette. Immediately I can feel a difference in the formula. The new shade called Grunge, it's lighter and more Vaseline-like, whereas the older shade was more thicker and gel-like. And it was also more pigmented. Okay, so I couldn't really find any matches in the last row. Okay, so out of the 18 shades, I only found 6 that were similar. And although this is a purple leaning palette, the purples in this palette are very different from the other palettes like the Rose Quartz or Mercury Retrograde because these purples are more toned down. I think if you like collecting Huda Beauty's eyeshadow palettes, this palette will make a great addition to your collection. I hope this video was helpful to you guys. If you liked it, make sure you hit the like button. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Thank you. Bye.